Once upon a time, the Green Book provided African Americans with a safe haven during travels in a segregated society, serving as a beacon of hope and resilience amidst discrimination. In 1962, New York City, Tony Vallelonga earned the nickname Tony Lip due to his persuasive skills. Working as a doorman and mediator at the Copacabana nightclub, Tony is the sole provider for his family. Tony is out of work for a few months as the club undergoes renovations. He and his wife, Dolores, are struggling to pay the rent and keep their 2 children in their home. When 2 black guys come over to repair the sink, Dolores kindly offers them lemonade, but Tony discards their cups after they use them. An old contact arranges for him to be interviewed for a job as a doctor's driver, and the interview is at Carnegie Hall. Tony discovers an elaborate apartment upstairs above the hall. Dr. Don Shirley, a concert pianist, sits on a throne while conducting the interview with Tony. He's on a music tour from the Midwest to the Deep South and needs a driver who could manage the difficulties of racism in the South. The 2-month tour ends close to Christmas. Given the appropriate compensation, Tony can make it work. Don also requires his shoes shined, suits ironed, but Tony immediately declines the job, claiming he is not a butler. Disappointed with the interview, Tony visits a bar where a few mob figures he knows from the club offer him shady jobs. He declines. Don phones Tony's residence the following morning and requests Dolores' approval for her husband's extended absence. When she agrees, he hires Tony for the pay discussed. Dolores asks Tony to write letters. The record company gives Tony half the money up front and promises the rest after the tour, if the Don Trio doesn't miss shows. They provide Tony with the Green Book. During the drive, Tony is very chatty. His eyes are not always at the front. Tony also never stops eating, drinking. He tries to kill Don with secondhand smoking and enjoys peeing on the side of the road. Their differences are quite obvious. At Pittsburgh, Tony will be introduced as part of the team. Don advises Tony to adopt a different last name, suggesting his last name is difficult to pronounce, and to refine his speech around guests. Tony prefers to be himself and would rather wait outside. Don accepts his decision. Watching from outside, Tony is impressed with Don's piano performance. While waiting, he gambles with other staff outside, but Don scolds him for his behavior, explaining that Tony had the choice to be indoors, unlike the rest. In the car, Tony flips on some contemporary tunes, only to be met with Don's unfamiliarity with Aretha Franklin. Tony jokingly questions Don's blackness. At a rest stop, Tony snatches up a jade stone for sale on the ground, but Don disapproves, insisting Tony return it, emphasizing the importance of honesty. In Hanover, Tony checks the equipment before the performance, making sure the venue has a Steinway piano, as per the contract's requirement for Don's exclusive use. Tony instructs the stage technician to replace the piano, but the technician responds disrespectfully with racist remarks. Tony handles it in his way, shocking the trio group bandmates. That night, the Don Shirley Trio delivered another stunning performance. Tony writes to his wife, often updating her about his meals. As they pass a Kentucky Fried Chicken in Kentucky, Tony, the foodie, seizes the opportunity without hesitation. Don, who has never tried fried chicken before, hesitantly agrees to give it a chance at Tony's insistence. Initially unsure, Don slowly begins to devour the chicken with delicate fingers, finding it delicious. Tony offers him another piece, and they share a moment of bonding, laughing together as they throw the bone out of the window. Tony, caught up in the moment, quickly reverses to pick up a drink. They reach the first colored people-only residence, a stark contrast to previous venues. That night, Don drinks alone, as others insult him for looking like a butler. Don heads to a bar alone. Tony, enjoying his whole folded pizza, rushes to a bar where they find Don being held by 3 white men. Don is assaulted by white patrons, prompting Tony to intervene by imposing that he has a gun and demanding their release. They escape. Back at the motel, Don questions if Tony has a gun, but Tony denies. Tony ensures Don doesn't go anywhere without him. They head towards the next show. Don coaches Tony on enunciation as their car breaks down near a field of black workers. They draw attention, emphasizing the disparity between Shirley's status and the workers' laborious lives, leading to yet another misfit scenario for Don. At a grand mansion in Raleigh, North Carolina, Don is introduced to a sophisticated crowd by the host. The host purposely serving fried chicken makes Don uneasy. During intermission, when directed to use an outhouse, Don politely declines and opts to return to his hotel for the restroom. Later, Tony questions Don's friendliness with rude people. Oleg reveals that Don chose to tour the South instead of earning more money elsewhere, leaving Tony puzzled. Tony writes to Dolores as promised. His letters are questionable. Don steps in to transform them into poetic masterpieces. Dolores reads the letter with tears. In Macon, Georgia, Tony and Don spot a suit in a store window, and Tony suggests Don to try it on. When the shopkeeper realizes it's Don, he refuses to allow him to try it on. Tony washes his shirt in his hotel room. He receives a phone call and is taken to the YMCA, where he finds Don sitting next to a white man in the locker room. A policeman implies that Don and the other man were involved in a sexual situation, and Don has a cut on his face, suggesting a fight occurred. Tony offers the police money to let Don go. Outside, Don criticizes Tony for rewarding the police for mistreating him. They drive to Memphis, where Tony offers makeup for Don's bruise, but Don declines. Outside a hotel, they encounter Italian men from New York who tease Tony for working for a black man. Speaking in Italian, they offer Don work and to meet at the bar later. In his room, Don drinks whiskey alone and applies makeup to his wound. When Tony prepares to meet his mafia friend for a drink, Don intercepts him in the hallway, speaking Italian and offering Tony the position of road manager with increased pay. Tony declines. He assures Don he's just going to have a drink downstairs. Don apologizes for the previous night, and Tony brushes it off, saying he's familiar with the complexities of the nightclub world. In the hotel lobby, Tony asks Don about his musical background. Don explains he learned to play as a child and was the first black man accepted to the Leningrad Conservatory of Music. Despite pressure to play popular music, Don acknowledges the importance of classical music. On the road again, Don dictates a letter for Tony to write to his wife. Dolores reads it aloud, impressed by Tony's expression. Tony's relatives praise the family's genetic eloquence. They continue traveling, encountering skepticism in Louisiana. As Christmas approaches, Dolores and her children decorate the tree. During a heavy rainstorm, Don and Tony are pulled over by a cop who orders Tony out of the car. The cop discriminates against them, leading to a confrontation where Tony punches the cop, resulting in their arrest. In jail, Don asserts his rights and calls his lawyer. Don lectures Tony about maintaining dignity and avoiding violence. The police station receives a call from Robert Kennedy, intimidating the officers. In the car, Tony is excited that Robert Kennedy intervened, but Don finds it humiliating and scolds Tony for resorting to violence. This leads to an argument. Tony insists his life is harder, while Don lives in luxury but faces racism whenever he's off stage. Don expresses his frustration. So, if I'm not white enough, and I'm not black enough, and I'm not man enough, then tell me, Tony, what am I? They settle in a rundown hotel, and Don asks Tony to put out his cigarette. Don reads Tony's letter, approving of its sentiment. In Birmingham, Alabama, the venue's general manager welcomes Don and Tony for the Christmas show, emphasizing its significance. Don is directed to a small utility closet to change into his suit. At dinner, Tony joins George and Oleg, who orders vodka to mark the end of the Cold War. Tony complains about Don's dressing room, prompting Oleg to recount Nat King Cole's historic performance at the venue in 1956 and the brutal violence he faced for playing classical music. Oleg explains Don's choice to tour the South, because genius is not enough. It takes courage to change people's hearts. Don attempts to join his group at the table, but the host refuses due to club rules. Tony intervenes. Don insists on being treated equally, stating he won't perform unless allowed to dine in the room. The general manager tries to persuade Tony to convince Don otherwise, but Tony refuses and confronts the manager physically. They disregard any potential payment. Don ultimately decides to leave, and they depart. Don and Tony visit a black restaurant and bar, drawing attention due to their unconventional pairing. At the bar, Tony jokes with the bartender while Don orders drinks, pulling out a stack of cash. They enjoy a chicken dinner. When asked about his attire, Tony proudly introduces Don as the greatest piano player in the world. Encouraged by the bartender, Don showcases his talent on the piano, impressing everyone with a complex classical performance that earns him cheers and applause from the crowd. After a night of music and dancing, Don suggests they head back to New York in time for Christmas Eve. Suddenly, Tony uses a gun to scare off potential robbers. They embark on the journey home. As Tony's family prepares for the holiday dinner, Don drives through the Bronx while Tony rests in the back seat. They arrive at Tony's apartment, but Don declines Tony's invitation to join the family festivities. At the crowded dinner, Tony arrives and warmly greets his family. Back at his apartment, Don dismisses his driver for the night and reflects on his journey. Tony's brother made derogatory remarks about Don. Tony quickly intervened and told him to stop immediately. Later, Don appears at the door, and Tony embraces him, introducing him to his family. The family warmly welcomes Don, and Dolores expresses gratitude for Don's assistance with Tony's letters. The duo maintained a lifelong friendship without judgment. For upcoming content, click like, pound that subscribe, and hit notification. Thank you for watching.